He was a double sinner in the larger sense that everyone knows as an adulterer and a murderer. And if I were going to compare myself to being greater than Jonah, which is what Jesus did, um, I might have chosen David. And I would say, and a greater than David is here today. But Jesus chose Jonah and said, a greater than Jonah is here today. I find that interesting. I found that curiously interesting through the years. I'll share that with you right now. And I will then be to draw all of these in, receive an unusual blessing from this perspective of Jonah. Because there was another prophet, Balaam. Okay, Jonah was a prophet. He was a restless prophet. Balaam was a prophet. He was a disobedient prophet. Now, I don't like to be either restless or disobedient. And we as church members like to think that we are obedient to the principles we know of the Bible and that we are moving in the direction towards God. But look at Balaam for just a second so I can set the stage for you, because he said an amazing prophecy. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel. Numbers 24:17. Not my word, but the opinion of many Bible scholars. This is the biggest, most magnificent prophecy from the Old Testament that pointed to the Messiah. Once again, this is the greatest messianic prophecy of the Old Testament. And who pronounced it? A disobedient prophet. And when we identify with Jonah or Balaam or any one of these in our circumstances when we think we're running away from God, we're going to find that God is a gracious God who sees us where we are and understands where we are and appoints us in our desperateness to utter things that will edify the church, to say things, to write things, to do things that in the larger context may elevate us. God loves each one of us as his children, special child. You, I'm pointing to the left, I'm pointing to the right, I'm pointing to all of this congregation, and I'm saying you are special in God's sight. And if you feel sorry for yourselves, as we'll find out, Jonah started to feel sorry for himself in the last chapter, then we might remember Jonah in this new context, that God forgives and God will show grace. Now, let's continue through the lesson and discover this. Jesus chose Jonah as a point of comparison to declare himself greater than. And I would have said greater than David. And Jesus said, now a greater than Jonah stands here in front of you, meaning himself. Now, why was it necessary? As a matter of fact, we know a few things about that, those circumstances. I will divide the 4 chapters of the book of Jonah this way. Chapter 1, he ran away from God. You know the story well. Chapter 2, he ran towards God. He finally was chastised. He realized there was no point in running away from God. He ran towards God. And then he ran lockstep with God to do God's will. And he pronounced the warning against Nineveh. Then finally, he was feeling sorry for himself, and he was trying to protect his reputation, and he ran without God. And we're going to find in these 4 chapters that we can identify with every single one of them. I will explain that as we go ahead, but how do we see ourselves in this picture? You know, we had when Pastor Dan was in Glendale, we had a pastor from Iraq, and for some reason I can't remember his name. And he came to our officers retreat to talk about prayer. And one of the things he said, he was from Nineveh. And he said, that's not how it's known today. It's known today in Iraq as Mosul. So if you read in the news about Mosul, that's Nineveh. And then he described a little bit about Mosul, and I just got to realizing this morning that Mosul, like Nineveh, There's two other cities I discussed with you in the past. One is Damascus, and the other is Babylon. Well, we don't have Babylon today, and yet we see not too far from modern day Babylon, the old Babylon. I showed you a picture of that when I talked about it some time ago. And then the same thing with Damascus. According to the encyclopedia, Damascus is the world's oldest, longest existing city, continuous. That means that it never stopped being Damascus from the earliest times we knew it as Damascus, and it continues to this day. There's one thing wrong about that. Damascus doesn't sit where the old Damascus used to. It's not far away from, just like Babylon, modern Babylon is not too far away from biblical Babylon. Why is this important? Because we now see that if you go to Iraq, according to this pastor, fantastic testimony for our church. God is working miracles in the modern day Nineveh, which is Mosul. That's all I'll say about that, because I want to stick with this story, and I will talk to you about a man who was the president of Weimar Institute. And again, I'm at a disadvantage because I can't remember his name, but he came to our PEP rally. Now, the PEP was under the presidency or leadership of Benny, Dr. Benny Banaag, and then he passed it on to Chester. And now we don't know the future. I personally don't know the future of PEP, but I was in it from the beginning. I was a founding member. Well, at the PEP rally we had, the president of Weimar Institute came and shared testimony, and he said, with tears, he said, I ran away from God. I'm going to end this story a little later, but I want you to know, here was a man today, he said, I was brought up in the Adventist church, and I slipped away, I backslided, and my mother never gave up on me. She told me she was praying for me every day. He was telling his testimony, crying. He was in tears to recognize that his mother would never know how it turned out because she had passed away. But as I said, I will finish his story on the last slide. So we have stories of many people. Maybe you can identify with the fact that we sometimes run away from God. Maybe not in a big dramatic way that Jonah did, or even a smaller dramatic way as in taking a college course that would lead us into the kind of service that God is calling us into. It could be smaller than that, but we know what God is saying. He's saying certain things to us through our parents, our pastors, through circumstances, but we ignore those callings and we say, not now, Lord. How well do I know this? Because I preach in Nepal, in India, Thailand, Cuba, all live, Kenya, but now no longer live. I'm doing by Zoom, but I will tell you, I sometimes receive a very disheartening piece of comment. Pastor Ray, I liked what I heard you say, but I want you to know I'm not ready for Jesus to come. I'm working hard and I have so much unfinished business. If he comes right now, I will never finish this, and I really want to. Most of the time, this is in a worldly context, but occasionally someone will say, I want to finish something in the church, in missions, and that's all well and good, but it is disheartening. We want Jesus to come, and for anyone to say, no, I hope that he is going to delay his coming, is turning the picture upside down. Okay, so do we run away from God? We can answer that privately, personally, as the Lord impresses us. Why? Well, the history of the Assyrians caused much of Jonah's distress. I talked to you about Babylon, and I described Babylon as being a kind monarchy. They're the gold and the statue. And you may not know this, but Babylon's existence as a world power lasted only 60 years. 60, that's all. And then we slip into Medo-Persia. Um, but you know, in the 60 years, Daniel was a young teen when he was conscripted to Babylon. Do you remember that Daniel lived through all of the kings of Babylon? And he was 90 years old by the time he was serving the last king. So that's a very short monarchy, 60 years. All right, but what happened before Babylon? Why don't we have a story about Assyria? But Assyria was before Babylon. As Babylon was profiled as being kind, Assyrians were very cruel. Do you remember the story of the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well? She said to Jesus, "Why are you asking me for water? Don't you know that Jews and Samaritans have no relations? They don't they don't get along well together. Why or why not? Because the Assyrians had swept into northern kingdom of Israel and took all of them into Assyria, left behind the poor people to take care of the land. And then they sent priests from Assyria to the Jews who had. They decided to stay with their religion. So the Assyrians sent for some Israelite priests to return from Assyria by this time, from Babylon, before it became Babylon. And they sent home some priests to kind of salvage the situation. Well, the priests were pure in their religion, but the Samaritans had already been contaminated by the Assyrian pagan religion. So by the time the true worship of God came together with the false worship, it became a diluted religion. And that's why Jesus and the Samaritan woman worshiping the true God, worshiping him in spirit and in truth, and all of that diluted. I tell you that very quickly so that you can understand that Assyria was a longer lived dynasty, and they were very cruel, and they were the northern kingdom of Israel was taken into captivity, and now we call that Samaria. All right, that's the background. So let's go past that, and we are following the Stat School Quarterly that says a 3-day rest. Oh, this is a very interesting transition, because down in the belly of the whale, Jonah came to his senses, and he prayed for the holy temple. He prayed for the sanctuary. In my Bible, and some of yours, it says holy temple. Aha, a Jesus said, a greater than Jonah. I'll take you right back to the Mount Olivet discourse. Jesus was watching the people, and then he said, I tell you the truth, the time will come in this generation, meaning in 70 years, sorry, in 40 years, before 70 AD, I mean. All right, before 40 years are over, which is a generation, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, not standing on top of another. This is very interesting. The disciples said, we need to find out what Jesus is talking about. And they isolated him, and they said, Master, what do you mean? And well, with the thing. And so Jesus. Now, I bring it up because the Holy Temple was revered by the Jews falsely, pridefully. And Jesus wanted them to know their object of veneration was wasted. The time would come very soon when all of it would pass away, and which prophet did Jesus choose? Aha, Jonah. We did not know until we read this lesson that Jonah had prayed for the holy temple, that Jonah was jealous for the Lord's reputation in that small regard. Later on, we'll find that he was not totally jealous for the Lord's reputation because he had a pity party. So now let's at least connect this. He prayed for the holy about Jonah's orientation. In the belly of the fish, Jonah experienced God's grace. Orphaned by his mother, 2 weeks before his 7th birthday, she died. His father took him at the age of 11 to the sea. He had a terrible life of dissipation. He became a teenager. He went out. He drank himself to stupor, and then he was alone in Africa, slave trade, and he was put in charge under the charge of a woman who was conscripting slave labor. He was a slave trader, and 34 years later, he came to his senses. He found God's grace, and he wrote. I'll tell you about it. First, he was in a boat, and the boat was listing, and he knew they were going to go under, just like Jonah. So he prayed to the Lord, if you will save us, I will turn my life around. And so God caused a miracle in this boat where there was a leak in the bottom. He then made the boat shift. The boat covered. He was saved, and he turned his life around. And he did so in such a way that he wrote a Congress or Parliament against slave trading. And he was credited by the act of Parliament to abolish slave trade. This man, John Newton, was the composer of the song we sing today, Amazing Grace. And so he, by running away from God, then he found God's grace. And just like Jonah, turned in the right direction. He stayed in the correct direction. Jonah, a crucial part of the Christian experience. In the 4 minutes I have left, I'm going to try to see if I can accomplish all of our ministry that has we have the mission to healing and deliverance as part. His mission accomplished, Jonah was still with God. The quarterly uses the word tantrum. He was like a child throwing a tantrum. He had a pity party. He was saying, this is what I've done for you, and look at what it has gotten me. This is a wrong attitude. When he arrived in Nineveh, this is a large city. If you walked on the top of the wall, the walls would be so wide that you could have two running side by side. That's a wide piece of wall on the top. So found he said, okay, I'm going, Lord, I will run in the same direction. And he delivered the message. And they repented. And God saved them. What we can get from this is God will turn away his wrath when we turn away from our sin. And we are so grateful that things to judge, but under God's control. And he judges mercifully. And so he had this pity. The problem was that we have been teaching that we have the spirit of pride, we've got the spirit of rage. These are called strongholds. And they are blocks to our growth in Christian grace. And so we teach people in our Nepal Zoom lesson last week. I was talking about the man-pleasing spirit. And what is that? That is the kind of spirit that says, I would like to work for the Lord. I would like to do the right thing. But what will people think? This is a problem. These others, and that's not what Jesus did. The man-pleasing spirit is a spirit that will controvert the because you're saying what man thinks about me is more important than God's call on my life. We need to go in the direction that God calls us in spite of the criticism that we receive. We'll go past that right now because of my time constraints. Jesus did not allow the Spirit to tell him what to do or what to say. He stood against what the Pharisees preached. He said, "You're why?" And then he told them, "You have heard it said, you shall not lust, but I tell you that that's from the Pharisaical teaching. You have heard it said, you shall not murder, but I say to you, you hate your brother, you have already." And it came again from the Pharisaical tradition. Jesus was breaking what they were preaching because you are taking the law of God and you're making a very difficult thing for people to be happy in the Lord. You have joy in the Lord when you follow the Lord's commandments without putting more weight into the keeping of the commandments. This is what Jesus did. He thought it not robbery to be equal with God. Philippians 5:8, 1 Corinthians 2, the mind of Christ. All right, so Philippians 2:5 starts out like this. Let this mind be in you, which was in Christ Jesus. You know the rest of that. But I want to point out that we can have the mind of Christ and let it be this way according to Jesus because he lived a humble life. And then he responded with humility to the death of the cross. And with all of that, we have this wonderful perspective of the story of Jonah. And we can indeed find peace in that. Now let me quickly close with Weimar. So the president of Weimar finished his story and said, wait for us to get to heaven because I have come back to the I have come back and I have served the church. And my mother, who died never knowing whatever happened to her son, will find me in heaven. There will be such great rejoicing. So when we go in whatever direction we have, we may still find grace when we realize, imitate me even as I imitate Christ. So I'm going to ask you, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. As we contemplate John, let us take away that we can identify with, and let us then say, Lord, I will follow you. May we learn from Jonah's example. But yes, we run away from God, and even when we run towards God, sometimes